Hey everyone, welcome back here for AP World History. Today we're going to continue talking in Unit 4 about the expansion of empires, right? Imperial expansion. And one of the things that we need to talk about today with topic 4.6 is the challenges that arise to state power. And what we're talking about here is sort of two different types of resistance, right? Or challenges to imperial rule. One is sort of the general resistance, right, that empires experience from people that it conquers. And second is resistance from people who were enslaved. So today we're going to focus on this sort of essential questions of how did the development and expansion of state power result in external and internal challenges, right? So external, sort of that general resistance that empires faced as they conquered people, and internal or rebellions from enslaved people between 1450 and 1750. All right, and there's lots of different examples and topics that we can go into here in terms of social, political, and economic resistance to state power. Right, so these are some of the examples here of challenges to state authority and imperial expansion during this time period. So we have lots of different examples that we're going to be able to look at, right? The College Board has given us this list of illustrative examples, right? And I don't want you to be intimidated by this list, all right? Again, there's lots to sort of sort through here, lots of good, rich examples of resistance to state control and state domination. So my advice is to pick a few, right, to focus in on in more detail. That's going to give you sort of the most bang for your buck in terms of your free response writing. Have a couple of really good, well-developed examples to be able to talk about. So my advice would be to make sure to have at least one example from both sections, right? One example of local resistance and one example of enslaved resistance as well. So one example here of successful challenges to European imperial expansion and resistance to European rule, to Portuguese rule in Africa, comes from African ruler Ana Nzinga. Her kingdom had seen itself under attack by Portugal, right, in terms of slave raids. She was facing attacks from neighboring tribes and losing land. So she actually had originally aligned herself with the Portuguese to try to protect her kingdom, right, to keep them out of the slave trade, give her some protection against raids from neighboring kingdoms. The Portuguese, though, never fully honored their terms of that alliance, which quickly fell apart. Nzinga fled, but, right, she used that opportunity to incite rebellion against Portuguese rule amongst the Ndongo people. She actually allied herself with the Dutch as a counterbalance to Portuguese control, freed runaway slaves, and is an example of successful resistance against Portuguese rule. Right? She ends up ruling for several decades as an example of counterbalancing against European rule in Africa. It's also important here in topic 4.6 that we continue to look at resistance from enslaved peoples against imperial expansion by these European empires as well. And there's a couple good examples here from British controlled areas, both in the Caribbean and in North America. Slaves in the Caribbean, right, where many slaves were sent to work on sugar plantations, right, they'd seen a large growth in the numbers of African slaves brought to the Caribbean, right, began to organize and fight for their freedom, right? So some slaves in the Caribbean fought to gain freedom in what were known as the Maroon Wars in Jamaica, right? Maroon refers to the descendants of runaway slaves in Jamaica who were able to successfully resist British imperial control, right? They formed their own independent settlements under the leadership of Queen Nanny. But slave revolts were becoming more and more common in the Americas, right? Because as in some locations, enslaved Africans outnumbered free white Europeans. And this is particularly the case in the southern British colonies, what becomes Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, that area. So you can look at the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, right? The Gloucester County Rebellion in Virginia in 1663. Enslaved Africans conspired, right, to demand their freedom through a slave uprising. Many times this ended, right, and this is a good example of this, where they were put down pretty harshly by colonial authorities. But that didn't stop this larger trend of enslaved people rebellion that carried on through the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th century, right? The illustration here of Nat Turner's slave rebellion in Virginia in 1831 as another example, right? And so we see oftentimes large resistance movements from enslaved peoples across the Americas as well. And so again, right, there's lots of good examples here to pick from this unit. So I'm going to add some information into the comments section and on our class website that you can check out as well. I wanted to give you just sort of a couple of examples that you might choose to focus on as we're talking about the era of challenges to state expansion and authority.